for the past 500 years, an open international trading system has really been the exception rather than the rule. From the late 1400s with the voyages of exploration, really up until the middle part of the 19th century, the 1840s and 50s, the world economy was quite closed within typically colonial empires. The colonial empires, the European colonial empires, had a system called mercantilism, which essentially forced the colonies to sell to the colonial powers and forced the colonies to also consume goods from the colonial powers. So the colonial empires, of which the 13 colonies in the United States were part, were covered by this mercantilist policy. And in fact, it was one of the reasons that we revolted, that the 13 colonies revolted. The Stamp Act and things like that, taxation without representation, were all part of Britain's mercantilist system. But all the European powers had a very closed economy system, closed in the sense that it was closed to their empires. It was open between the colonies and the imperial countries, but it was closed within empires. In the 1830s and 40s, that began to change, and the big switch can usually be dated to 1846. In 1846, the British Parliament voted to repeal the last of their very important restraints on trade, tariffs. And for the first time really in world history, certainly in modern world history, a major country, the United Kingdom, had no barriers to the import of goods into its economy. That was really unprecedented. And not only was it unprecedented, but it hasn't happened since. There is no country today that has complete free trade. All countries have some barriers to trade. In the 1840s, the British, in a sense, moved as leaders of the international economy. It was the world's industrial powerhouse, the largest economy in the world at the time, moved towards free trade. And in the subsequent decades, most of the industrial countries moved with it. Not all. The United States remained very protectionist, one of the most protectionist countries in the world. So did Russia and some of the other countries that were lagging behind, that is, that were industrializing. But the most important industrial powers, especially in Europe, moved quickly towards freer trade, that is, allowing more trade within them. That was the first, what we sometimes think of as the first era of globalization, that lasted from the 1840s or 50s until World War I, 1914. And in those years, the world economy was very tightly integrated. Capital flowed across borders, goods flowed across borders, and people flowed across borders, even more than they do today proportionally. That all came to an end with World War I. And then after the war ended, there was an attempt to restore that globalization Mark I, that open world economy that had characterized the late 19th and early 20th century, and it failed miserably. It ended up with the Great Depression and currency wars and trade wars and eventually shooting wars. The industrial world in particular came out of World War II convinced that going back to the old ways of the 19th and early 20th century was probably not going to work. But at the same time, there was the desirability of an open world economy. So starting in the late 1940s and early 1950s, led by the United States, the world's capitalist economies, and especially the rich economies of Europe, North America, and others, moved gradually towards reducing trade barriers, reducing barriers to investment, reducing barriers to financial flows. That was a gradual movement until the 70s and 80s. And it picked up speed in the 80s. In the 80s, you had much more rapid opening of international economic transactions. And by the 1990s, we'd reached that second era of globalization. It was not just the industrial countries at that point. A lot of developing countries that had been quite protectionist and quite enclosed within their own self-sufficient economies began opening to the rest of the world. And then the most stunning move was the fact that between 1989 and 1991, the Soviet Union, Eastern and Central Europe, its allies in Eastern and Central Europe, the so-called centrally planned economies, abandoned centrally planned socialism and moved towards integration into the world economy. China and Vietnam had done that in '79. And so by the 90s, essentially, almost every country in the world had thrown in its lot with globalization. That was the high point of globalization, the era of great euphoria about globalization. In a sense, the Cold War was over, the West had won, and the West's commitment to international economic integration was unchallenged. And that went on for about 20 years. And starting around 2008, 2009, with the great financial crisis that really brought an end to a period of relatively rapid growth, people started calling globalization into question. And the past decade has been one in which many, many groups, political parties, political movements around the world have been questioning whether globalization is in fact a good thing.